Everything do unto others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. That's the case with strangers. It should be much more so the case with our brothers and sisters. Jesus was not the first person to say words like this. In fact, what we call the Golden Rule is also known as the Confucian concept of reciprocation. In the 5th century BC, Confucius said, anything that you wouldn't want done to you, you should not do to someone else. Jesus said, whatever you would have others do to you, you should do. So it's a little bit different. It's a little more proactive. That Confucian idea is, if you really would not want people doing something to you, then you shouldn't do it to other people. But Jesus is saying, if there are some things that you wish people would do for you, then you should just go out and do those things for other people. And we should do that. We should apply that to one another here within this group. Now, another interesting thing, an interesting phrase that was used a couple of times in those earlier verses was when Paul was tying in, when he's talking about building one another up and etc. Speaking truth to one another. Speaking truth in love. What does speaking truth have to do with building up or healing? I think that there is a hint in this key verse, part of which that we read earlier at the very beginning from Colossians 3. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. All these things echoing other things we've discussed. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together to perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So there's several things mentioned in there that we've already touched on. The idea of having unity, the idea of all being one body, and the idea of needing to be thankful to God for the fact that he has been so kind and gentle with us, and therefore we should be with other people. But there's something else that's mentioned in there. Teach and admonish. Teach and admonish. And it's mentioned right in amongst all those other things like compassion and kindness and humility and gentleness and patience. And I think this kind of comes in with something that was mentioned earlier when we were doing our going around thing that people have a hard time doing, because this teaching and admonishing business is something that is important. It's something that contributes to the health of the body, but it's mighty tricky business. It is mighty tricky business on the part of both parties, both the one dishing it out and the one receiving it. Particularly this receiving admonition, not something that I think comes naturally to us. And I looked up admonish just to get the exact wording of the definition, and what I found in my dictionary was it means to reprove or scold, especially in a mild, good-willed manner. How in God's name do you reprove and scold somebody in a mild, good-natured manner? It's not easy, but it can be done, and we are called upon to do it. Like many things we're called upon to do, I think we have to rely on God's Spirit to enable us to do that. But it's very important that we be able to do it. But like I said, it's not the sort of thing that we tends to enjoy having done to us. Unlike the advice given by the psalmist in Psalm 141, verse 5, where it says, "Let a righteous man strike me, that is a kindness. Let him rebuke me, that is oil on my head will not refuse it." Well, I think our heads tend to refuse that kind of oil, but we're being admonished by the psalmist not to let that happen, that we should regard it as oil, something soothing, something healing. When a righteous person admonishes or strikes you, you can feel like being struck. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." If you think about ways in which iron can be used to sharpen iron, I think of a blacksmith, right? And he's sharpening iron, he's making swords or axes or whatever. The whole sharpening process using other iron involves some smiting. I guess that's where the smithing and smiting and banging things together in a controlled way, not just in a rage, but in a very controlled way to achieve a certain result. Or I think you could also think of this process when a person could take like two blades and use them to sharpen one another. There's a lot of friction involved there. Either way, there is actually another force involved that is using that first piece of iron to sharpen that other piece of iron. And despite the fact that there might be friction involved or a little bit of clanging, the end result is the improvement of both of those pieces of iron. And if you have ever experienced this by being involved in a conversation with someone else in which one or the other of you says, in a kind way, "You know, I just think that you did the wrong thing. And I think you need to think about what the right thing is." And if that is handled in the right way and in a godly way, the result, usually in my experience, is that both people feel a whole lot better afterwards. When God's Spirit is present and invited into such a conversation, and it really does feel good. But being able to do that requires a quality that has also been mentioned in those verses we looked at earlier. Aside from just the compassion and the kindness, we are called to exercise humility. 1 Peter 5:5, "All of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God opposes the proud but shows favor to the humble." So you have to be able to learn to show humility, whether you are the admonisher or the admonishee or any other relationship that you have with one another within the body of the fellowship. And that raises the question to me, what is humility? What does that mean? I heard a sermon one time that has always stuck with me, in which it was said that God is humble, but God is not modest. Because modesty means being objectively aware of your limitations. God, if you read Job, he's not being aware of he doesn't have limitations. He's God. Humble means being willing to lower yourself. And God has certainly shown his willingness to do that. Jesus showed his willingness to do that in serving and ministering to others. So that's what we need to do, is learn to be humble and learn how to be willing maybe to lower ourselves from perhaps the station or the position or the argument that we think we should have. And that also involves being willing to uplift the other person. One other thing that's been mentioned in 1 Peter chapter 2, "Therefore rid yourselves of all malice." That showed up in Romans there too. Get rid of your malice and all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. So malice, I looked that one up too. Malice is a desire to inflict injury or
or suffer